This episode was brought to you in association with Bloomsbury, India. Welcome back to yet another episode of the Kitabi Karwan podcast. Today we have with us a very interesting guest, Mr. Gautam Chintamani. Most of you might know him from his work as a film historian who's written the absolutely fantastic biography of Rajesh Khanna. But today I'm been talking to him about his new book. After writing a biography of Rajnath Singh, he's written a book titled The Midway Battle, Modi's Roller Coaster Second Term, which gives an interesting insight into, well, as the book's title goes, the second term of Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Without giving much away, let's jump right into the interview. Hi, Gautam. Welcome to the Kitabi Karwan podcast. I'm so glad to have you on. And to be very honest, I've been excited ever since I got the copy of your book. And I read about when I read about you, because here's the thing, right? And this is the first question that I ask every guest on my podcast. Today we live in a world where you can, with Google and with social media and everything else, an author is as much a celebrity as possible, right? I mean, you can Google the person, you can find out a lot about them. But I believe authors and writers in general, and well, most people have a side hidden to them, right? A side probably they keep hidden away from the world for whatever reasons they choose to. But today, maybe can you share something with us that probably we won't find out about you through the internet or through the bio on your book?
So, hi, Siddharth. It's great to be here and thank you for having me over. Well, I don't know. I mean, you do have a point that keeping this day and age in mind and, internet and social media and what have you, I don't know how much of a person can be hidden. I would like to believe that I am off camera what I am on camera. But amongst the things that, not many people would know about me is that without bragging, I cook very well. Uh, the pandemic gave me an opportunity to really cook, 3 meals a day for the last 2 years almost. And me and my wife, we don't have any kids, it's just the two of us.
Okay.
We haven't called our cook back or our domestic help back. And we pretty much, figured out a new way of life. So, yeah, in that aspect, not many people know that I cook very well, and I'm very proud of it. I used to be one of those fancy wannabe chefs who would always get thrown out of my mother's kitchen or my aunt's kitchen because they would think that I talk more and I cook less. But now I've started enjoying it, and I find it quite therapeutic also.
That's quite interesting, and I'm pretty sure your wife would be really glad that you cook so well, because I think cooking in itself, like personally, I find it to be such a intensive activity. Like there's so much precision involved with getting the flavors right. I mean, hats off for having that as a hobby. And I'm really glad about the Sholay poster in the background. I'm a huge Bollywood buff, which also got me really excited about your book. And that actually gets me to the next question. I mean, I know we're not today. We're going to talk about the Midway battle, but I can't resist, like, bringing up the fact that you're a film historian, and so this is something that actually piqued my curiosity. How did you go from, I mean, from writing about films and documenting them? Your Rajesh Khanna biography was very well received, to writing about politics, like the Rajnath Singh biography and the Midway battle. I mean, generally those are two different worlds, and I mean, I'm sure you are interested in both of them. But how did this, if I can say, dissonance came about in your life?
So I think it has a lot to do with your surroundings and your interests. So I was always interested in films. I think
Right.
that is largely because of my grandfather, my Nana,
Mhm.
Dr. Arudra. He was a very well-known author and film lyricist. In fact, two of Rajesh Khanna's, one of Rajesh Khanna's earliest hits and Jitendra's first big hit, the Furs and The Train, were both written originally in Telugu by my grandfather. And he
Oh,
also wrote the screenplays for the two films in Hindi. So
okay.
I think that piqued my interest to some extent.
Right.
Also, my wife was associated with the youth wing of BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Yuva Morcha,
Mm.
and she used to get these very bad migraines, and sometimes she could not drive. So I was a designated driver
Right.
on many occasions, and on one such occasion, she took me along to see Mr. Rajnath Singh,
Right.
and I was very interested in meeting him because I studied. My father was in the army, and I started my education in Allahabad. So,
Okay.
as a student, I followed a lot of UP politics at that time, and Mr. Singh, as the education minister in Kalyan Singh's government, had introduced the Anti-Copying Act, the law which made copying a criminal offense, and that really changed the way examinations were approached in the state. So I was very
Right.
interested, and I think because of my wife, I got an access to Mr. Singh, and I got to know that perspective. Uh, of course, it's your interest, and my interest has always been uh, socio-political impact of
Mhm.
cinema. I mean, even when I was
Right.
writing about Rajesh Khanna or my book on Kayamat Se Kayamat Tak, and then Pink, and
Mhm.
the new book that I'm working on, it's a Vinod Khanna biography. So these things for me are also about how these people have been influenced by the zeitgeist, captured the zeitgeist, and redefined it. So for
Right.
me, talking about a Rajnath Singh or talking about a Rajesh Khanna, I
Mhm.
look at it from the same historian's perspective. That
Right.
what were these scenario and what were the circumstances in which they emerged. So for
Right.
me, it's not that much of a big shift
Right.
because in this country, so that you would be aware, every generation has its own interpretation of cinema, politics, and cricket. So these are few things when
Right.
you're talking about the socio political fabric of the country.
Right.
You always tend to look at these three, four aspects.
Right. Right. No, and it just reminds me of that really common saying, right? Like India has three major religions: cricket, politics, and Bollywood, and that's how it's been. Like, I mean, the
That's
hero
true.
worship. I mean, I mean, when you said whether it's Rajnath Singh or Rajesh Khanna, I mean, people in their respective fields, they are actually occupying the same class of superstardom, I guess. In terms of fan following, or in terms of how much people follow them, or how people are affected by them. But yeah, that's quite an interesting segue of things of how things have happened for you. So, what got you interested in writing about Mr. Modi's second term in particular? I mean, what was the catalyzing factor? I mean, it's without. I mean, without even getting into the idea of political leanings, it's you can very clearly say Mr. Modi's term as a prime minister, including the first one and the current one, have been impactful. They have been decisive. They've been impactful. They've created. I mean, there have been a lot of steps taken. History will be talking about what their impact is, but it has been an eventful prime ministership. So why this focus on the second term and not like his entire journey? And what even got you interested in the first place?
So, a significant portion of Mr. Modi's first term and the 2014 elections was
Mm-hmm.
covered in the Rajnath Singh biography. Because
Right.
when I was writing that the zenith of the book, or the fever pitch of the book, so to speak,
Mm-hmm.
was the 2014 elections and how Mr. Singh, as party president,
Mm-hmm.
pushed for Mr. Modi's name as the PM candidate, and
Mm-hmm.
how these two gentlemen kind of uh, took uh, their case to the public, so to speak.
Right.
Uh, Winning elections in India is, looked at from multiple aspects.
Mm-hmm.
But what happens, and ये this is something Siddharth आप फिल्मों में भी देखोगे. Popular
जी.
फिल्मों में क्या होता है that once you start हीरो की कहानी या हीरोइन की कहानी होती है, and once you get to the end, you're not
Mm-hmm.
interested in what happens after that.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in real life, end is
Uh,
not the end in that sense, because
that
it is
sense, right.
almost like
Right.
a turning point.
Correct.
So sometimes you need to see what happens later. And I think
Right.
if you look at electoral politics,
Mm-hmm.
winning winning is important. But what is it important for? It is important for you to enable a certain kind of legislation. And in
Right.
that aspect, if you look at Mr. Modi's first term, and if you
Mm-hmm.
look at the second term,
Mm-hmm.
the midpoint of the second term, there have been milestone decisions taken. I think it was the mid 1950s, 1954 or thereabouts, where India officially adopted a socialistic pattern of society.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what does that mean? That essentially means that most of your policies and most of the way your functioning is going to happen in a certain fashion. Now,
Mm-hmm.
this socialist attitude was
Mm-hmm.
being questioned for a very long time, and then you have the 1991 opening up of the economy and the reforms. But if you see the first uh, Narendra Modi term, then you realize that there has been a significant shift towards actually adopting a more free market kind of an approach towards things. The recent farm laws are an example. The political controversy notwithstanding, I feel that the farm laws by in itself was similar to what the 1991 movement would have been for the rest of the economy.
Right.
But this is not about that. What got me interested was the pace with which Mr. Modi was working, the ground that the government had covered in terms of social programs and path breaking flagship programs like the Jan Dhan Yojana or the Ujjwala scheme, which really bridged the last mile in terms of delivery. I mean, if you, I don't know if the listeners here of of what age group they are, but there was a very famous uh, statement made by the then Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi in the mid 1980s that uh, only 15 paisa or something on those lines is what reaches out of a rupee spent on social programs to the final person to whom it is meant for. So this pilferage is also something which was addressed by the Modi government in the first term.
Right.
For me, the second term becomes very important because where India found itself in 2019 and where the world found itself. India
Right.
was emerging as a very important global player because if you see the foreign policy between 2014 and 2019, where the Quad was revived, India becomes a strategic geopolitical partner for a lot of countries. The misadventure of China in the South China Sea area, the opening up of information when it came to the Belt and Road Initiative of China and the imperialistic drive the Chinese had. Suddenly, India had emerged as a very, very important player because this is also the time where the United States and China were embroiled in a very bitter trade war. And India's shift from being an alternative to China just because it was of the same size or population wise, it was the biggest Asian country, वहां से shift करके actually becoming an alternative to China in many ways in terms of economic hub, in terms of a geostrategic partner, was something which the world was taking notice of. And then you immediately after that have the coronavirus pandemic. So for me, the pandemic brought the world to an equal playing ground where a first world nation or a developing country both were at sea when it came to tackling this issue and how you handled it, how you took care of the populace, the at the same time ensuring that the skirmishes with China at the border or the constant niggling of ISI and Pakistan based outfits, you had to take care of that. So for me, all these things become a very important factor in how Mr. Modi was going to look at the first few months of his second term. It so happens that the pandemic extended and changed a lot of things the way the world functioned. But my primary focus of writing this book was not just to look at the burning issues of between 2014 and 2019 and the election, but also give a historical perspective for the younger reader. When you look at things like the economy or when you look at foreign policy or take the CAA protest, for instance. So in my book, I go back to the Constituent Assembly debates regarding the idea of citizenship and these issues which were being, or at least the founding fathers were trying to answer at that time, which finally get answered now. So for me, that canvas was something that I was very interested in. And also, a lot of people get uh, politics in India and especially electoral politics in India, they are not willing to change the prism from which they view these issues. For example, there is an incident that I quote in my book that a Delhi-based journalist travels to Bihar and asks a young person there that whom would you vote for? And when the person says Mr. Modi, this journalist asks why Modi, and they say that what he has done for India's image at a global level is something that I'm very proud of, and that is why I'll vote for Mr. Modi. And this journalist ended up asking or thinking that how is something which is happening at a global stage impacting the mind of a voter in Bihar? and yet the twain was not being able to meet in the person's mind, that it is
Mm,
not the local bijli pani sadak issues,
mm,
or you know uh, as Indian psephologists or political analysts like to see, from the prism of caste and creed and religion. It's electoral politics is something beyond that, and the voter has been giving a lot of indications over the years and decades that they don't view these things from the same prism as somebody sitting, and no offense meant, somebody sitting in an air conditioned newsroom in New Delhi or Mumbai does. So all these things were playing on my mind when I was writing the Midway battle, and that the idea was to give where India stands at 75 years of independence and
right,
the journey from where it started.
right. No, that's quite an elaborate answer, Gautam. And uh, to be frank, I mean, it's quite obvious that you are very appreciative of what has happened by over the previous few years. I might personally disagree, but then that's not the merit of this podcast to be talking about. What I would was largely something that actually crossed my mind is something that actually happens a lot in India, and that often we find ourselves uh, as a writer, I think that's one of the biggest challenges you probably would have faced, right? Or like a question that will is very fundamental that's going to be asked to you. Why you? Why should a person listen to Mr. Gautam's views on, the politics of India or the history of India or how electoral politics have evolved? I mean, just for example, in one of my previous seasons, I had Dr. Shiv Shankar Menon come on the podcast. He's been a former national security advisor. He's been a former foreign secretary, and he spoke particularly about China and the skirmishes. So, and I think that's a burden every non-fiction author at any point of time carries, particularly when you're trying to address a larger sociological issue. So, I mean, how did you qualify your research in that sense? Like, I mean, did you feel that burden of kind of, going out of your way to justify what you're kind of trying to state? Or, I mean, I don't know, how did your thought process work in that sense?
I understand the basis for this question, and see, the thing is that in today's world, mid uh, midway discussion is
Mm-hmm.
something which is losing a lot of ground.
Mm-hmm.
Everything is so drummed up and everything is so polarized that
Mm-hmm.
there is a view and there is a counter view, which
Mm-hmm.
should always be the case, according to me. But I understand what you're trying to say. In fact, it reminds me of what the Honorable Vice President said at the launch of my book. He
Mm-hmm.
said that everybody should read everything. There should be uh, a source of information for people to access
Right.
and to enable them information to make an informed judgment or an informed decision in that sense. So I am not. Uh, I'm not trying to push or validate my point.
Mm-hmm.
As a historian, I think the responsibility of a chronicler in that aspect, irrespective of what your leaning is, or if you're writing from that point of view, which I was not, or I mostly in my books I don't, you need to present the facts as they are,
Right.
and you need to let people take a call on that. So
Mm-hmm.
if you're talking about, say, a Rajesh Khanna, a
Mm-hmm.
highly polarizing figure, if I can use that word, because on the one hand I met people who thought that he was an incarnation of God, if
Mm-hmm.
not God himself. And I don't mean that by his stardom, but also by the generosity that he exuded. At the same time, I met people who thought that he was the most vile person that they have come across, and they both were as passionate. And if you look at popular media, then there is uh, enough material to corroborate both sides of the story. So
Right.
for me, um, the focus is not to highlight something. For
Right.
me, the idea in this book was that the research is out there. It's what has also happened is that, unfortunately, that the more easy things get in terms of access. I mean, you would like to believe that internet and social media has made everything very easy, but it has also created a huge heap of things which you can't look beyond a point. In fact, it reminds me of a recent book that I read and I reviewed it. It was on Christopher Nolan's cinema, and Tom Schoen, the film critic who wrote that book, is very friendly with Nolan. And they did an experiment which Tom mentions in his book. Nolan asks Tom that just Google Christopher Nolan's next project. So they do that, and it's a live thing that they do, and they're chronicling it. And they come across millions of pages on that topic. And Nolan starts looking page after page, page after page. They go around 10 pages and they realize that every information after that has got nothing to do with Christopher Nolan's next project. So now the point I'm trying to make is that there is information out there which you do not have access to because you don't know how to go about it. And I blame the media to a very great extent here, because look at popular media today and look at the news portals or look at news agencies. I mean, you run with a story which has no credence at all, and by the evening or by the next morning you realize that ऐसा कुछ हुआ ही नहीं था. And there is a retraction which comes in some tiny little corner. So the point I'm trying to make is that why would somebody, like you asked me, why should somebody read this book? I say why not? I mean, it is one of the many books out there which is giving you some information, which I feel is not as easily accessible to a lot of readers, a lot of younger readers. So the idea behind writing this book was also to put information in a way which is accessible to the younger reader. Like, for example, take the whole CAA protest, for instance. Now, what was the legislation? What was being projected in the name of the act which was passed? And what was being drummed up across the board were three completely different things. Now, there is reason to believe that, okay, as a citizen of India or as somebody who's free to express their views, you are worried about a certain thing which might happen because of this law being in place. Now, the whole debate about how CAA equals to NRC is completely a figment of imagination, if you ask me. Was there a demand for NRC in Assam? Yes, it was a Supreme Court demand. The demand was made by Supreme Court. In fact, the Modi government in its first term was asked by the Supreme Court that why are you not conducting it in a time-bound fashion? But does the CAA then suggest that there will be an NRC pan-India? No. Did politicians from different parties at different point in time say that there is a need for a national NRC because you need to differentiate who's officially a citizen of India and who might not be a citizen of India? Yes, there has been a talk. But does that talk entail into legislation? No. So the reason I'm saying all this is that at the end of the day, a news portal or a news media outlet is a business. So, see, also the point I would like to highlight here is that at the end of the day, news media and a media portal is a business, and a business needs to, sell something. A business needs people to buy what it is pitching or selling. So, आप क्यों देखोगे उसको? Maybe because it tickles your fancy. I mean, I'm putting it very, very, bizarrely, but that is what I used to be like that. Sometimes, I mean, some years ago, about 10, 15 years ago, I would watch the news to get entertained.
Right.
And then I realized that, I am missing the bigger picture. So I am open to everybody presenting their points of view. Right. And I believe that everybody has every right to say what they want to say. Right. आप अपना research कीजिए, आप उसे consume कैसे करते हैं. So, like the point I would like to make is that if there is the entire repository of the Constituent Assembly debates available freely on the internet on Government of India portals, how many of us have read that? How many of us actually know what was the debate surrounding a lot of contentious issues? And I use the word contentious here knowingly. So for me, I think the more material is out there for people to access, for people to understand what is happening, I'm quite okay with that.
Right. No, I get where you're coming from, even though, so like, and that's something that I've constantly been, I mean, not on my podcast, but in general, spoken to a lot of people about. I might not necessarily agree with what you're trying to say. Like like your interpretation of the CA is not something that I completely agree with. But the idea is
So,
to be able to kind of talk about it without kind of wanting to rip each other's heads off, right? Without with
yeah,
having
yeah,
that pure, right. So I think that's I know it's just kind of a sidetrack from the book, but then I think that's one of the problems we're facing as a polity today, right? The ability to kind of talk about contentious things, as you mentioned correctly about contentious issues in the Constituent Assembly debate, like which I luckily have read. I'm a lawyer by training, and constitutional law was one of my
wonderful.
favorite subjects in college. So I ended up reading a lot of those Constituent Assembly debates. But that was something that I was marveled by, right? I mean, the beauty of the fact that how maturely and how eloquently they could debate topics which are still contentious and keep their points across to the other party with even while disagreeing with them. And now it just turned into this cacophony of to the extent it's violent. It's violent. It causes deaths where people disagree. So it's
Siddharth, there's a very interesting anecdote here that I would like to share.
right.
Many of us think that media has become strange or bizarre now. This was
Mhm.
always the case. In fact, the other day I came across a quote of Dr. Ambedkar from the early 1940s, where he
Mhm.
said that news media used to be a good thing, but it has forgotten how to do its job.
Right.
So these are things which will always be there, and I think that is the issue I have, that I feel that in this world today there
Mhm.
is a great need for a midpoint for
Mhm.
people to talk about things, and
Right.
I don't think that this is something which is missing from uh, in public or with people who have diverse views. I think this is something which is not there amongst friends anymore, amongst families anymore. So that I feel that there everybody should strive for a situation where this midpoint uh, can be can be achieved by
Right.
some miracle, and I think
Right.
it's our responsibility.
No, I completely agree. I just the only bit I get is perhaps it's probably our privilege that kind of allows us to have that midpoint in the first place, right? I mean, I think there are a lot when it comes to contentious issues. For a lot of people, it goes beyond simply being a matter of policy debate and to a matter which affects their lives in a very deeply personal manner. And I guess that's what prevents a lot of people in a lot of issues to kind of come to that midpoint. But anyway, I want to take a step back from this serious discussion and kind of come back to your writing. So, I mean, we've spoken about how film stars and politicians and how Bollywood and politics are two of the three major things that go hand in hand in India. But was there a major difference when you were writing your book as a historian, as a film historian, versus writing your book about uh, socio-political analysis of the country? Was your approach different, or did you notice a very different way of, like, in terms of how you research, or how in terms of how you pen down your thoughts, or how you go about your entire process?
For me, it's more or less the same way of going about, and it's a very interesting thing that in both these fields, politics and films, you
Mm-hmm.
need an approval of sorts from the public. Unless you have that,
Mm-hmm.
you're not going to become successful. In that aspect, I think that both these worlds have their own particular way of attracting and approaching the the end user, if I can use that word. So in that aspect, I think um, more has been recorded about politics, or the socio-political essence of the country in that aspect. Cinema, and especially popular cinema in India, was not taken as seriously in terms of chronicling, which I have always found very strange, because it is a very powerful medium. Now, the one way of looking at film stars was that even if they were trying to do something serious, you would mock them, or their own fraternity would mock them, and they were never told that what they were doing could be looked at or interpreted in a way which is beyond the realm of film glossies. I remember
Right.
that uh, almost 10 years ago when I had started working on the Rajesh Khanna biography, there were very few books that looked at cinema in that aspect. And when I say few books, I also mean that only a particular segment of popular cinema was looked at in that light. So if you had somebody like a Nasreen Munni Kabir, a
Mm.
fascinating author, attempting to look at the impact of Gurudat's life, or if you
Right.
had somebody talking about Raj Kapoor's socialistic cinema, or if
Mm-hmm.
you had somebody talking about how Kaifi Azmi's poetry or how Shailendra's poetry impacted, you were taken seriously. But if you wanted to say that I want to look at a film like Sautan made by Savan Kumar Tak,
Mm-hmm.
featuring Rajesh Khanna, Tina Munim, and Padmini Kolhapuri from a socio-political prism. Forget the people. Even Savanji was, flummoxed when I asked him this question.
Mm-hmm.
He said, "Yeah, we never thought of these lines."
All of this.
In fact, uh, in my, I've been lucky to have a great number of conversations and constant conversations with filmmakers like Ramesh Sippy, and Ramesh ji would always hear me out or you know, indulge my point and then very nonchalantly add ki, but Gautam, what you're saying
Mm.
has the benefit of hindsight. When we were
Correct.
doing things, we never had hindsight in that aspect. So the approach in writing about a film star or
Mm-hmm.
the impact of a film star on the populace or writing about a major political movement, say like the emergency and how the emergency uh, impacted the entire opposition in India
Mm-hmm.
uh, may seem two different things. They are also to some extent, but the approach as an historian would more or less be the same because you're
Right.
looking at the scenario in which these conditions came about, and you're
Mm-hmm.
also then looking at how these had an impact. So for
Right.
me, in the last 10 years, there has been a marked change. Now, today, if I were to call a filmmaker in Mumbai for research or speak to them, they are now aware or they're confident enough that what they thought of high craft and which was largely mocked by the own film journalist as
Mm-hmm.
being, nonsense
Mm-hmm.
is now being interpreted from a very different prism. So they are a little
Correct.
more confident of talking to you. So
Correct.
15, 20, 30 years ago, if you approached a Manmohan Desai talking about the socio-cultural impact of Amar Akbar Anthony, he may have not spoken to you not because he didn't like you, but because he would have thought that I didn't think like that, or why are you thinking like that? But
Right.
today, if you were to call somebody and even talk to them about something which you would consider to be a hardcore typical masala film like say Loha,
Mm-hmm.
featuring Dharmendra and Shatrughan Sinha, they can still give you what they actually felt
Mm-hmm.
about while making that film without being apologetic about that. So I think that has really changed how you write about things. But
Mm-hmm.
as a historian, it's more or less the same approach for me.
Right. Gautam, all of this just got me really curious, particularly because of your love for cinema and given the fact that you're a writer. Because I have a core belief that almost all writers are voracious readers themselves. That kind of just goes hand in hand. So, is that true in your case as well? Do you like to read? And if yes, where did the roots of this plant germinate? I mean, what did your parents kind of start making you read, or whether you just gravitated towards books in general, or what was it for you?
So yeah, I mean, I read just about anything. I'm not that frequent of a reader anymore because
Mm-hmm.
there are other things which take your attention away. But I think it's your surroundings, and I think being an army kid, uh, there was always an access to libraries, and both parents inculcated the habit of reading, and I think most parents do that, and most parents give you the freedom to do what you want to do. In the 70s and 80s, kids they really liked to be out there, get dirty, climb trees, and get hurt, and especially Fauji kids. Us Fauji kids, would get hurt, go to the MI room, and then just get the tetanus shot, then come home and tell your mother that aaj ye ho gaya. Don't
Mm,
worry about it.
mm,
So yeah, I mean, uh, reading was something which was inculcated by parents. Both parents enjoyed reading books. In fact, the entire neighborhood, I remember, Fauji neighborhood, every house had a good library, and they really let kids read because they thought that at least this is something. थोड़ा खेलना कम होगा, थोड़ा पढ़ लोगे तो maybe you'll have interest in other things. So yeah, as a child, the usual port of call was your Enid Blytons and your
right.
Alfred Hitchcock Three Investigators and your Tintins and your Asterix. I'm a huge Tintin fan. My wife is a
Oh,
very big Asterix fan.
all
We
right.
have debates even to this date, and both of us we knew each other as kids. I mean, her
Okay.
father was also from the army, and we were neighbors, and we knew each other from grade 3. So we've had this ongoing debate, Asterix versus Tintin, from that point. Later, usual stuff, Siddharth.
Mm,
Your Sidney Sheldons and your Jeffrey Archers. I
right.
marvel at that kind of writing, and Earl Stanley Gardner or James Hadley Chase,
Mm,
Ross MacDonald, and Surendra Mohan Pathak in India. How you could write that kind of stuff, fiction.
mm,
Lately, reading has been limited to, if I'm reviewing a book, I
mm,
I read that stuff, or if I'm researching, I end up reading. It's very rare now that something of interest can
mm,
or you have the time to do that. But lately, I've been reading a lot about uh, Chinese politics because of research. And
right.
one book that I would highly recommend here is Ezra Vogel's definitive biography of Deng Xiaoping.
Mm,
It's worth reading. It's also available on Audible, and I, by some strange coincidence, I have 8 unused credits on Audible, so I can really indulge myself.
right.
Yeah, so I enjoy reading, and also it is something that everybody does. I think that people don't get that kind of time, or they
Right.
feel that reading is not as relaxing as it used to be.
Right.
But yeah, this is the kind of stuff that I read these days.
Right. Okay. Now that's. I'll tell you why I was very curious to know what kind of stuff you read because of the fact that you love cinema and at the same time profess to be a reader, and these are generally people fall in like two separate categories. Either they love cinema and they don't read or barely read, or they just read and don't really have time for this thing because they're mutually time consuming activities and you just get that amount of time on your hand. But Gautam, tell me this. So I won't ask you for your favorite books, but I will ask you for maybe a book or two which really impacted you as a person throughout your life. Maybe a read that kind of changed how you looked at things or how you examined things, or just had like a deep impact on you and shaped you as a person.
I think every book, to some extent, can do that. But more than one particular book, I think at reading something at different stages of your life kind of changes the way you look at things, and I think that would that would qualify for being something that changes how you see things. I think one of the books that uh, uh, I would rate Srilal Shukla's Rag Darbari and Fitzgerald's Great Gatsby as two of my favorites, and Edith Wharton's Age of Innocence. I mean, for some reason, these three books have become something that I read once a year, or
Mhm.
some portion of it, every now and then. And I think they kind of were relevant back then when it comes to depicting society. They are relevant now because I think people across different generations may have different interpretation of things, but at the end of the day, certain human tendencies are the same. And I
Right,
think it's a battle for us humans. It's a battle with that tendency which makes us do things a certain way, and we can see the result of it all around us, and the desire to do things in a different way, which is something which is more of a spiritual calling, if I can use that word. I think
right,
somewhere reading uh, your favorite texts across different stages in life makes you relook at things and also gives you an opportunity to catch something which you may have missed the first time around. That when you apply to real life, because we are all seeing things, we are noticing things, and some of us are, most of us, uh, are just rushing through life. I mean, one day seems to be the same as the next one. And there was a very old ghazal written by Manoj Kumar. I mean, his son was a singer. A lot of people don't know that Manojji had two
Oh,
sons, and Vishal was an actor, and Vivek Goswami also cut an album called Surai. Fascinating songs. So
right.
उसमें एक गाना था, कल उसमें एक लाइन थी, कल की खबर भी थी ऐसी जैसी आज की ताजा. So sometimes we we see things, but we don't see things. We don't notice them, and I think that's
Right.
because of the pace that we're living at, and we don't get an opportunity to just take a moment and have a wider view of things and पूछ लो यार क्या हो रहा है, क्या करना चाहते हो. And I think these 3 4 books, and I'm sure everybody has their own favorite books that they keep, or favorite films that they keep going back to and revisiting and noticing something which you didn't notice. And I think that habit, if you can put in life, कि चलते चलते अगर एक आध मोमेंट ले लिया और कुछ देख लिया, just enjoy the moment. I think that will hold a lot. So yeah, I would recommend these 3 4 books. Highly recommend these 3 4 books.
Right. No, that's a very interesting idea of pausing and kind of soaking in what's happening around you rather than just passing through it and looking at it. And on that really intense but sobering note, we've come towards the end of our podcast. So I have one question for you before you go. You did mention you're working on a Vinod Khanna biography right now, but and I'm supremely excited about that. But is there some? Have you ever considered writing fiction? Is that something on the table as a writer? Is that going to something we'll see from you in the future?
Oh so let's go back. I mean, it's a nice cyclic thing here. I just didn't realize that this question kind of brings me back to the first answer of your first to the first question that you asked. So a lot of people might not know that I had started as, or in early late 90s and early 2000s, I used to write for television, and I used to write fiction. So
Oh,
one of the TV shows that I wrote in the early 2000s was a Hindi law series called Siddhant, and
wow.
it was nominated, or at least if knowledge serves me right, it was the first Indian television show to be nominated for an Emmy in an
Oh,
international
wow.
drama category.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so that was in early 2000s. So there is there are a few things on the fiction front which are happening. So I don't know how many are aware that uh, there is a film being planned on my Rajesh Khanna
Yeah.
biopic, uh, which is Farah Khan is going to direct it. So I'm writing the screenplay for that. So
Okay.
there was another show that I was working on, a web series which was fiction based. So there are plans to work on fiction. I don't know whether a fiction book uh, might happen soon,
Mhm.
because again it's the time, and there are a few
Right.
other projects in the pipeline. I'm also working on a Dharmender biography for a very long time. I keep having this, last 5 years I've been on and off having a chat with Dharamji, and he's a fascinating individual, and he's had a
Right.
fascinating career. So I don't know whether I will have the time to work on a fiction book, but yeah, web series and stuff like that. So there are
Right.
certain things on the anvil.
Right. No, Gautam, but like going by the fact that you've written an Emmy nominated screenplay and the way I've read your book, you are clearly a wonderful writer. So I'm actually very excited to, if at all, I would urge you to write fiction more as well. As much as I love reading your
Thank you.
non-fiction work as well, but
Thank you
it'd
so much.
be
You're very kind, Siddharth.
very fascinating to read it. Thank you, Gautam, for joining us today. This was a really interesting chat, and I know all my listeners would love it. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you, Siddharth. It was entirely my pleasure, and I'm very happy that we had this chat. And it's like, you know, uh, we may not have the same, not generally you and I, but many of us may not have the same way of looking at things or reading the same stuff, but it's podcasts such as these and conversations like the one you and I had, which kind of open up a little more, a few more doors for us. So thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. Really enjoyed. The pleasure was entirely mine.
Thank you, Gautam. If you enjoyed this podcast, please check us out on all our social media platforms. We are available across all podcasting platforms on YouTube, on Instagram. You can find us at the rate Kitabi Karwan on Instagram, or just search Kitabi Karwan on Google or a platform of your choice and you'll find us. We carry out Instagram lives, giveaways, we talk about books, we talk to bibliophiles, talk to authors, and basically try and create a reader's world through all of our platforms. Do check us out and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you.